case of this, the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War is a significant moment, not so much because it is exactly 100 years, but because 100 years is a long time, and in the course of that time, many different things have been thought about why the war happened and what its consequences were. And in recent years, there has been some shift in the way people think about that, at least amongst historians. It would be broadly agreed that the assassination of the Archduke was something which acted as a trigger and not as a fundamental cause of this war. I think one of the discussions that can usefully emerge is to ask why it was that in the interwar period, immediately after the war was over, during the making of the settlement at the Paris Peace Conference, and really right up to perhaps 1936, the view of what had started the war centred pretty much on the idea that it had been caused by Germany. But there were other views, and they ranged from it had been caused by the armaments race, that it had been caused by nationalism, by imperialism, by socialism. Quite a number of isms were either individually or collectively said to be the cause of the war. But the other view, as significant as the view that Germany caused the war, was that it had been caused by what people sometimes call systemic collapse. In other words, that the whole machinery of international politics ground to a halt, couldn't cope with this crisis. And that leads on to saying it's nobody's fault. It was a factor of the system and not a factor of deliberate political activity of a bad kind. And what we see is that in the Treaty of Versailles, which was the part of the Paris settlement that dealt with Germany, that's all that the Versailles Treaty does do. There are lots of other treaties that deal with other parts of it. It was said in that treaty that Germany was responsible for the war, and that reflected that view of it, and Germany was treated as guilty, and therefore was always on the losing side when territory was redistributed, had its armed forces reduced, and had reparations imposed to keep the economy weak. The other side of the coin, the systemic collapse one, produced the League of Nations, which said, well, one of the things that collapsed was that Germany was able to refuse a conference. The League of Nations will always be there. So nobody can refuse a conference. Little did they know. Herr Hitler was perfectly capable of refusing conferences. So was Signor Mussolini. But it was the view at the time that if you had a formal organisation with some staff, with a building in a place, Geneva in this case, you would then have a permanent forum, and there never need be a 1914 again. So those two things came together. But it was not really until after the Second World War that you get an interesting shift in the way in which people looked at it. When people said Germany had caused the war, they meant by manipulating the assassination crisis. But in the 1960s, the professor of history in the University of Hamburg in Germany, a man called Fritz Fischer, who amongst historians is deeply famous, wrote a book, and then subsequent, particularly one other book, in which he effectively said, looked at in a longer term, looked at, shall we say, from 1890 onwards, you cannot avoid the conclusion that we, Germany, did it, and we meant to. He wasn't interested in manipulation of the crisis at all. He was interested in the unfolding of German policy generally. And also, he was aware of and prepared to include in the equation the political problems caused by the German constitutional system. Now, this was a terrible thing to have done. German professors, apart from anything else, are persons of extreme influence and power, perhaps a little less so these days, but they used to be. If a serious German professor said something like that, that had real implications. And Western Germany virtually had a national nervous breakdown, and Fischer was sacked from his chair. And a huge argument developed about whether this was true or not true, particularly amongst German historians. But whatever you may think, anybody might think who studied it all very carefully as to whether Fischer was absolutely right or absolutely wrong, or what the other ones said were equally absolutely right or wrong, what emerged from it at the end was a kind of consensus that Fischer might have overdone it, but that the evidence of the movement of German political opinions in the 20, perhaps 30 years before 1914 was pretty damning one way or another. So that really was a major change. And when you think about it, it was tough for the Germans, because they had been able to adopt the view that 1914 was an accident waiting to happen, that 1939 was obviously the act of a madman, and not their fault. And there had been a certain amount of agreement about that in the Cold War years. The British and the Americans didn't want to disturb any German views about things when they were crucial to the Western side in the Cold War. So various things got knocked off pedestals at this point, really quite firmly. And the present position is, I think, that a majority of people take a vaguely Fischerite position, that if you do want to go round assigning some sort of blame here and there, and the blame game was great, played throughout the 1920s. I could give you a description of why every single country was in some way responsible for the First World War, and it's valueless, all of it. If you really want to do that, you will come to the conclusion, I think, that of all the powers involved, the only one who had exhibited over a period of years a positive tendency to want to expand and to be prepared to risk war, they were only prepared to risk it, as crises up to 1911 showed, but then finally in 1914 turned risk into reality. Only they were doing that. Everybody else was reactive to the situation, responded to a situation. Only the Germans were, as it were, positive in it. That isn't to say, nonetheless, that the fact that it was the Archduke, and therefore involved the Habsburgs, and with that all the problems and difficulties that the empire had experienced for a very long time in the Balkan area, there he was, in the middle of it, and he got assassinated. So the place may be more important in some ways than the person. Nonetheless, it was a trigger and not a fundamental cause. And there is one way of looking at it which I think demonstrates it quite well. If it had been the case that the government in Vienna had been able to react in respect of Serbia immediately after the assassination, it would have been seen as a natural response to what was, definitely, an outrage. But they were not. And the reason that they were not was that the Hungarian government in Budapest was extremely anxious that there should not be any great triumph in respect of Serbia for two reasons. One, because they feared that it might lead to the reversal of their independence within the empire, to the reversal of the 1867 settlement. And secondly, they feared it might lead to the annexation of more Slav territory with which they would be saddled and which they did not want. And they therefore delayed and delayed and delayed even the sending of an ultimatum, never mind an attack upon Serbia, until it did happen in the end, after great pressure was put upon them. And at that point, the event itself had retreated a bit, and nobody would thought at the time, or could have thought, that what the Austrian government did was a knee-jerk response to an outrage. It was an obviously considered response, and that was a much more dangerous situation, as it turned out, fatal for them. If we consider the first, the broad situation first, what we see is that at a particular point in the crisis, on the night of July the 27th, 1914, the German government did something which showed that the security apparatus that had, broadly speaking, kept the peace throughout the 19th century, since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, had collapsed. And what they did, that causes one to say that, was that the other powers, not of course the Austrians, but the other three, asked the Germans to allow a conference to assemble, like the one that had met in 1912 and 1913 to deal with the Balkan Wars, in order to deal with this problem. And they flatly refused to have that happen. The principle of holding conferences rather than dashing to war was a major principle that lay behind the security apparatus of the 19th century, which is known as the Concert of Europe. Nothing musical, just cooperation. And the collapse of the Concert of Europe had been gently happening for about 20 years. But it was a successful system, and it had acquired inertia. When the reasons for it disappeared, it didn't quite disappear. It was a little bit like water running out of a bath. You know once you pull the plug that it's going, but until it finally says glug, you don't know that it's gone. And glug is what happened on July the 27th, 1914. Now, the security apparatus, which is probably a good way of describing it, depended on there being a reasonable equality of power across the major states. And that was so through most of the 19th century until it was blown apart by the rise of Germany. I'm not suggesting for a moment that that was Germany's fault. It wasn't in any way, but it was a fact. It also depended upon there being a general agreement about where it worked within the world. And the 19th century was marked by an expansion. It started by being just Europe. It then the Ottoman Empire was brought into it. In the 1880s, Africa was brought into it. And then, in the 1890s, a huge, very significant crisis developed in Asia. And this was a crisis that the Concert of Europe could not handle. But its members were exposed to it. And the fact that that crisis could not be handled was extremely damaging to the conduct of European affairs. And with the making of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902, there came a political connection between Europe and Asia that had never before existed. And that then led to what really was the First World War in Asia, the Russo-Japanese War of 1903 to 1905, in which the Japanese defeated the Russians heavily, by land and by sea. And that changed the situation in a way that linked Europe and Asia, meant that anything that happened in Europe that was difficult rebounded in Asia, and the reverse. And that is one of the reasons why people who say, well, the First World War was just a European civil war, are entirely wrong. That is a really serious error. This was not just a European war. Europe happened to be the focus of a war that resulted from the first phase of political globalization, put it that way, which we perhaps understand better than anybody in 1920 or 1930 would have been able to understand it. So what do people do? What do governments do if they find themselves deprived, however gradually, of a security apparatus upon which they had relied? the answer is they will turn to see if they can find friends, which means making alliances, and they will turn to see if their forces, their military forces, need to be increased, which leads to an arms race, and then a competition in the actual level of armaments. And both these things happened, almost on cue, quite extraordinary. As the water left the bath, what the ducks, if you like, floating there, landed on the bottom, and one was called the alliance system and the other was called military competition. Secondly, the domestic questions. This is a very long subject. The Habsburg Empire had suffered all through the 19th century from one very simple fact. The existence of a state after the Napoleonic Wars was dependent partly on the idea that a state should represent a nation and that a nation was entitled to be a state. Nationalism. This hadn't existed. States had existed in the 17th, 18th century, but nobody thought that there was a compulsion that they should be ethnically, the fact should be ethnically significant. After 1815 it becomes so, and it has been so, and pretty damagingly so, ever since, to a greater or lesser degree. For a country that was multi-ethnic and did not have a single ethnic majority, which the Habsburg Empire didn't, this idea meant that the whole notion of a multinational state was reduced in its significance, and they suffered from it. So did the Russian Empire, but to a much lesser degree. But the other party who suffered deeply was the Ottoman Empire, which had also been proudly multinational. So there was a natural anxiety at Vienna and reflected in Budapest all the time, that the thing simply couldn't hang together because it didn't represent a particular ethnicity. And to the extent it did, the German-speaking population was not a huge majority. It's doubtful even if it was a majority within the empire. And so the basic assumption upon which it rested, which was that it was an accumulation of territories, accumulated largely by Habsburg marriages, and that was therefore in a kind of way a property of the House of Habsburg, wouldn't wash in the 19th century. Nobody would buy that idea anymore. And so even if the Balkans were not full of countries saying, we want to be a state, we're a nationality, etc., and that was damaging, of course, for the Habsburg Empire, even if that hadn't been so, they would have been in trouble. So here we have a country suffering from acute anxiety about its future. In Germany, acute anxiety was in many ways even worse, but it was not at all for the same reasons. The reason was that when Germany was formed in 1871, just as a result of the victory against France in 1870, it was given a kind of constitution, but not a constitution of the sort that normally states have had, or still have. It was extremely weak in its expression of who actually was to run the country and what their respective responsibilities were going to be. And that lack of clarity led to a persistent executive muddle in Germany, which got worse and worse and was made worse by William II, who played with that a bit. He's not a crucial figure in any of this, but he did make the situation in Germany more muddled than it otherwise might have been. And so an ill-fitting political system in Germany was then confronted with one of the fastest industrial revolutions ever, an enormous demographic change within the country in the form of urbanization and much immigration into Germany, particularly from Poland, or from Russian Poland. And this change of weight within the demography of Germany and the economy of Germany was never able to be represented in its politics. And those who did run the politics were therefore constantly trying to find devices whereby they could somehow bridge the gap. And the device, unfortunately, that Prince Bismarck taught them was, when in trouble, have a foreign crisis, turn to the country and say, the fatherland is in danger, you've got to drop these terrible quarrels, we have to stand together. This led people, by the time, in Berlin, by the time 1914 was approaching, into a situation in which one well-known German general remarked, we are in a race between war and revolution. And you have to imagine that here is a political establishment that is frightened. And this is a deep-seated fear with a capital F, that either the international situation, which had produced alliances which they feared, would produce an attack upon them, unimaginable, but they believed it, or the domestic arrangements would collapse into revolution, and that would be the end of the system anyway. And if there is a sense of desperation about what the Germans did in 1914, that is the source of it. Not, in my view, an inbuilt aggressiveness. These people were suffering from intense fear. So were the people in Vienna, but about something else. In St. Petersburg, the fear was a bit more like the German one, that they had faced attempted revolution twice now in 1905, again in another episode in 1908-9. They thought that there was a strong possibility that the whole machine in Russia was going to come clattering down. In fact, it didn't until the war actually happened. And it didn't in Germany until the war happened. But in Germany, as 1918 appeared, so did the delayed revolution. In fact, sometimes forgotten. So here we have this really terrible mixture, noxious mixture of fear in three of the major capitals of a serious kind, and a breakdown in the security system which had underpinned international security through the 19th century. And it's into that witch's brew, if you like, that the assassination got dropped.